Joining on this special edition of the News Hour tonight is Mr. Mukesh Aghi, President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Thank you for joining me, Mukesh Aghi, and I want to ask you, as an Indian who heads the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, I want to get a sense from you on the perception of India. How is India perceived today, and how has it changed over the last decade?
Well, I think today India is seen as a rising power, a power which is a non-threatening power, and expected to be a great power one day. So people understand that, and that has shifted. If you look at 20 years ago, India was seen as a fragile five nation. Today it is in the top 5 economies. So last, I would say, 10 years, the economy, the perception, strategic direction of India has moved in a positive way.
I also want to ask you, in terms of de-risking the China relationship, do you think US and the rest of the world is looking at India, or is Vietnam more of an important destination in terms of ease of doing business? And is this more of an intent to de-risk China engagement than really something that's converting into reality?
Well, I think when you look at hundreds of US companies, they are looking at how do you basically de-risk from China. Yes, Vietnam becomes a possibility. Thailand does become a possibility. Cambodia does. But India becomes not only just a site for manufacturing, but a potential market for these companies, which other smaller geographies don't offer. So what we are seeing is a lot of US companies, you look at Apple, you look at others, are putting their manufacturing into India, not only from export perspective, but also from a growing domestic market also.
So let me ask you, in terms of the Indian market, yes, it's attractive, it's a large market, but decision-making process, how much is the engagement at your level with the Indian policy makers in order to smoothen what are some of the areas that still require attention? And when do we see actually a shift happening in a manner which increases this engagement and shifting of businesses into India, not just incrementally, but structurally?
Well, I think what we have seen in the last 10 years, ease of doing business has improved dramatically. It's never a perfect place. You'll have to keep on improving it. To answer your question, yes, we work with the ministries, both from finance, commerce, and external affairs ministry, to bring in investors, bring in challenges, and we work very closely with these ministries. There's sometimes successes, there's sometimes challenges, but that the process continues.
Let me also ask you, in terms of India, after 3 decades, we had a first majority government coming in 2014, then a second term for Prime Minister Modi. This time around, in fact, it's a popular belief that it will be a third term for Prime Minister Modi, something that he's even declared on the floor of Parliament. How does the external world look at Mr. Modi, his leadership, and the prospects of his returning for a third term?
Well, you have to look at purely from a political risk perspective. 10 years ago, India was seen a political risk country. Government would come in, a lot of scandals. For the last 10 years, we have not seen any major scandals. And you have seen a political stability coming in. The third term sends a very strong message that India has become politically stable, unlike the US, which has become politically risk country itself. So tables have turned, and I think India provides the promise of a strong government, strong policy, and strong investment destination.
So the cultural, social renaissance that we are seeing in India, is that something that adds value? Because there is a large diaspora of Indians in the United States. Does that really make a difference, especially the Pran Pratishtha, renaissance that we are seeing in several areas, the cultural ethos of India coming back, something that has a nostalgia value for Indians living in the United States. Does that add something to the
Well,
relationship?
it does. It does. When you look at, you have 35 million Indians outside India, and you have to understand the economic power is very strong. In fact, they generate 50% equivalent of India's GDP today itself. 5 million Indian Americans, their income is twice the average. They are 1.5% of the population in America, but 6% of GDP producers. So when you see the renaissance of India, they get excited. They want to connect with India. I think what we have to do is just go beyond the Indians, explain to the rest of the world why the Renaissance is important, because it's a cultural prospect of India moving across the world also.
Let me ask you a semi-political question. There is the Khalistan factor that keeps raising its head as far as India's relationship with Canada is concerned, and then it's also come up in the Nikhil Gupta case, conspiring to assassinate Sikh separatist leader Gurpatwant Singh Pannoon. Do you see this impacting Indian ties with the United States?
Well, I think between Canada and US, they've handled the situation very differently. We have a Canadian Prime Minister who goes into the Parliament and makes an announcement, that credible evidence to show, without having a process-driven, trying to understand what the real issues are. Whereas there is maturity on part of the Americans. They realize this relationship is important, but they also realize they have a process they have to deal with. So I think both sides, India and United States, have handled this with a lot of maturity, and I think it'll come to its own end, but it will not disrupt the relationship between the two countries.
Let me also ask you, how much of a role does Prime Minister Modi's personal chemistry with world leaders really impact the relationship between nations, especially with the United States?
Oh, tremendously. I think you have to understand, you have a Prime Minister who's able to connect, build trust, communicate very well in every aspect. When President Obama was there, he built that relationship. When President Trump came in, he built that relationship. You have President Biden, he has built that relationship. There's no single leader out there who's had that constant relationship with the last three presidents except this Prime Minister. So I think his personal charm, his personal leadership does have a very evident impact on the relationships.
To you, what are the gaps that still remain? What are the risk factors that are perceived as far as India is concerned? And how do you think there can be a way forward?
I think communication. You have to basically talk about India's story to the rest of the world. You have to talk about why Ram Mandir is important to the rest of the world. And I think that's where we're missing it. When you have a very strong liberal media, which tends to take a very biased approach on certain issues, then we need to counter that. And I think that's where the media has to play a much more pivotal role, communicating the India story.
But I thought, on the other hand, that the media in India was actually blamed for, actually exaggerating the India story, much more than the quote-unquote liberals would actually be able to digest. Are you saying it's still less?
Well, I think it's about perception, it's about maturity. And I think when I come to India, you see the energy, you see the vision of people, you see the excitement of the youth. You have a country marching in one direction, that's about economic growth. I think we need to communicate that more and more.
And when you factor in risk factors on the political front, do you look at the political formation, the India Alliance, as it has been called, by the opposition coming together? How do you factor the chances of the India Alliance vis-a-vis a very confident Modi-led BJP?
Well, I think you look at the last state election, it told the story that people want change, people want economic benefit, people want sense of stability, and they want security. And you have one government which seems to be executing on that. But more important, you have to understand, you have a Prime Minister who can communicate very well, who connects with people very well. But more important, he's delivering on his commitments in every aspect. So what you have today, for example, 8 Indians got released from Qatar jail. They had death sentence. They worked behind the scene, sorted it out without making any noise. To me, that shows leadership, that shows maturity.
Well, yes, that's a big victory for India and Indian diplomacy. But let me also ask you. In India, of course, many believe that Prime Minister Modi has unparalleled popularity, and there are agencies that have conducted popularity ratings of various leaders, and Prime Minister Modi always comes out tops. Is this a universal perception that you find across the world for Prime Minister Modi, or do you think we tend to make more of it in India than the reality is?
Well, you can't argue with the numbers. And, the Prime Minister has come out with approval rating of in the high 70s, sometime in 80, depending on what polls you look at. But you have to understand that perception, especially coming from the liberal media, seems to basically paint a picture of autocracy. It seems to paint a picture of less human rights, less religious freedom. And I think that's where we have to sit down and have a discussion and communicate more. Because here I am in your studio talking about the both countries. So there is a freedom of press itself. You can go and worship anywhere. So what we have to do is sometime a success of a nation is not appreciated by a lot of interest group, and they would like to make sure that that success does not move forward.
Okay. Mukesh Aghi, I also want to ask you, what are the upcoming areas and sectors where you would look at greater engagement?
Well, I think when you look at the partnership between India and the US, we have multiple areas where we look at on a win-win situation. For example, let's look at pharma. India supplies 30% of the generic drugs to the US, say bringing savings in billions of dollars. But India gets 70% of its API from China. How do you de-risk that? Recently we had an issue on cancer drug not coming to the US from India. So we worked very hard to make sure that moves forward. You look at in the artificial intelligence area, you have very smart group of engineers here. They can work with the US group itself, on the cybersecurity itself, on the quantum side. We're looking at J engine being manufactured. So I think there's a lot of areas of collaboration which could be a win-win for both countries. You have a young nation here, whereas the population in the US is aging. So what we need to do is see, at least in the 8 to 10 areas, there could be a critical factor which can provide a win-win scenario for both countries.
And in the coming days, how do you see some of these speed breakers being sorted out? Is there a constant dialogue, or is there some problem with the communication, as you said?
Well, I think you have the Vina Dialogue about to happen. You'll have people coming from the US security side and have that discussion going on. Yes, you will communicate, but you have to understand there's a communication between the administration, both US and India, which seems to be in the perfect platform itself. Then there's a communication to the masses itself. And I think that's where we see some of the challenges. So we need to look at how do we basically communicate the India story? How do you communicate the US story in India? US companies are generating almost 3 to 4 million high-paying jobs in India itself. A lot of R&D is happening. India has become one of the largest producers of mobile phones. Apple 3 years ago produced nothing in India, and by next year is going to produce 5% of its mobile phones in India itself. So I think we have a successful partnership. We just need to keep on communicating it.
Well, I think there's more homework coming in for us than for you, Mukesh Aghi. So clearly, on the communication front, we have a role to play, which we will. And as far as business interests are concerned, certainly in India, more investments will mean more jobs, and that's exactly the formula that India needs. We do hope we see more of this engagement, and we can take it forward to the benefit of both these very great nations. Thank you very much, Mukesh Aghi, for joining me on this very, very interesting session on the News Hour Tonight.